Thank you. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us continue. So we started yesterday in Os Samich Beis in Tzidkas Hatzaddik. So if you remember again, the Rebbe was teaching us about this concept that there are certain malos, there are certain, we'll call it qualities or behaviors that were unique in that they were associated by or with certain individuals, or certain individuals acquired these particular midos or character traits. They then became the purview of the tzaddikim, and then afterwards, ultimately, became accessible to all people in different ways. So we started yesterday with the midah of Yisrael. The first person to acquire the midah of Yisrael was Yaakov Avinu, and that midah ultimately is the actualization of internal kedusha. That every single person possesses an incredibly deep reservoir of kedusha, an incredibly deep pool of holiness. And the ability to access that, and the ability to find that, and the ability to really implement that was unique. That was Yaakov Avinu was the first person who was able to accomplish that particular initiative, he was the first person to be able to tap in to his inner Yisrael. So we're picking up on page Kuf Mem Tes. On page Kuf Mem Tes, the left-hand side by the brackets. So the Rebbe writes, "Va'amnam ma'alas shem Yisrael hu mofia u'miskale gamkin bekamo chilukei madregos bilti sapek lefi erech nefesh ha'adam ba'olam hazeh." Now, here's what it says Reb Tzaddik, the midah of Yaakov, which is the ability to tap into one's inner holiness, one's inner kedusha, manifests itself on a variety of different levels according to one's personal level in life. The truth is, we're going to see this is the theme. When we develop these different, what he calls milos, these different levels, these different levels of spiritual accomplishment, they manifest differently for different people. So, for example, as much as we're defining the trait or the milah of Yisrael as the ability to tap into your inner holiness, that manifests itself in different people in different ways. We'll see this later on. We'll say, and this is an incredible point. You see, when you begin this os, you begin to think that Reb Tzaddik is speaking about the elite of the elite in Am Yisrael, right? There are certain milos, there are certain qualities, there are certain levels that were acquired by certain individuals. Then they were ultimately passed down to that individual's family, and then ultimately again from the family to the tzaddikim, and Reb Tzaddik kind of stops there. So you assume that he's describing milos, he's describing levels that really are attributable to the righteous. And then Reb Tzaddik comes along and says, once it was absorbed by the righteous, it's absorbed by the generations. And once it's absorbed by the generations, it manifests itself in everyone, just in different ways. So for example, Reb Tzaddik says, even what he calls the pachos shebi Yisrael, kigon ame haaretz v'kal shebekalim, even an am haaretz, even someone who's just, ignorant, totally ignorant, still has this midah of Yisrael, still has this midah of internal personalistic holiness, which he has the ability to access. So this is quite beautiful. Reb Tzaddik says that for these milos, for these levels, for these attributes, for these character traits or behaviors, there's going to be a continuum. So, for example, let's take Yisrael, because that's the midah we're focusing on right now. So the midah, or the maila, as Reb Tzaddik calls it, of Yisrael, is, as Reb Tzaddik defined, the idea sheshoresh todaso shakol Yehudi b'kedusha, that my genesis, my root, my beginning, my essence is holiness. That there is an internal holiness that a Jew possesses. That is, and if he's able to tap into that inner holiness, he's able to accomplish incredible things. The first person to teach us that again was who? Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov, and again, you could kind of, why not Avram? Why not Yitzchak? Because remember again, Yaakov Avinu was the first person to engage in struggle. Because remember, as we're going to see, the way that this Yisrael holiness really comes out is through struggle. Right? The way most strengths come out is through struggle. But the way the Yisrael strength comes out ultimately is through struggle. All Reb Tzaddik is pointing out is that once Yaakov acquired it and developed it, he passed it down to his mishpacha. From his mishpacha, it went to the tzaddikim, to the righteous. And from the righteous, it spread to everyone. So now, says Reb Tzaddik, every single person has the ability to tap in to this maila of Yisrael. Now, obviously, does everyone tap into it in the same way? Of course not. Does everyone go ahead and actualize it in the same way? Of course not. But everyone has the ability to do so. So on the Yisrael continuum, on the extreme, we have Yaakov Avinu, and then again, across that continuum, you have everyone else plotted there. To the point that on the other side of the continuum, you may have a total Amaretz. You may have someone who's totally ignorant, the antithesis of a Yaakov Avinu, who spent years learning in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. You might have someone who's the opposite of Yaakov Avinu, yet that person has the ability to discover his inner Yisrael as well. Let's go a little bit weiter, we'll say, just to show you another example of this. Turn to page Kufnun, skip to the left-hand paragraph. Tzaddik has a whole piece over here about Gerim, which is also interesting, but again, not really material to our topic. Take a look at the next paragraph. Page Kuf Nun, left-hand paragraph in Mir Chasidus. So we'll say the next maila that Tzaddik describes over here is the maila of being a tzaddik. Being a tzaddik. So first maila was Yisrael, second maila is tzaddik. Umaila shem tzaddik. What does it mean to be a tzaddik? We'll say this is incredible. Dahainu shomer habris. That will say in Chasidus, what being shomer habris means is sexual purity. Shomer habris, that a person maintains the covenant, right, the holiness of the makom milah. That a person does not engage in immorality. It's interesting, by the way, that's what a tzaddik is. It's fascinating, right? A tzaddik is not someone who learns Gans Shas or Kol HaTorah Kol Rishon Achronim. Why? Because we'll say we know that's easy. I mean, if you have all you really need for that is time. Okay, so that's not easy to find. But I'm just saying learning is enjoyable. Learning is easy. I mean, you understand what I mean when I say easy. I don't mean it's easy for everyone. I just mean that the process of learning, if you have the right, avira, and you have the right teacher, and you have the right chaverim, becomes a very enjoyable process. Tzidkus is the ability to be a moral person. The ability to resist temptations of immorality. That's tzidkus. And I will say, who was the first person to acquire this maila, to acquire this level of tzaddik? Zocha ba Yosef Hatzaddik. Right? You both say, remember again, it's Avram Avinu, Yitzchak Avinu, Yaakov Avinu, Yosef. Yosef is Yosef Hatzaddik. Yosef Hatzaddik. Now we'll say, so why does Yosef acquire that? Now again, we know, why does Yosef acquire that? Eshes Potifar. So I'll say, so just want to point out, what does that mean? Avram wasn't a tzaddik, Yitzchak wasn't a tzaddik, right? Yaakov wasn't a tzaddik. So remember, like we just said before, these levels are reached through struggle. They're only reached through struggle. We saw this, by the way, just in Daf Yomi not so long ago, right? What does Yosef struggle with? Day in and day out, he has to actively battle the desire. He has to actively battle the temptation of Eshes Potifar. Well, so we spoke about this. Who amongst us could really stand up to such a temptation like that? You're a young man, all alone in a foreign land. No one else, right? No one else loves you. No one else cares about you. Here's a powerful, I'm sure, beautiful woman who expressed an interest. Expressed an interest is putting it mildly. But she expressed an interest in you. And every single day, she re-expresses that interest. And again, being with her not only satisfies carnal desires, but also goes ahead and potentially is your ticket into Egyptian nobility. Who could stand up to such a nisayon like that? So therefore says Reb Tzaddik, tzidkus, sexual purity, that's Yosef Hatzaddik. That's Yosef Hatzaddik. He goes on, v'zocha ba'lahanchil zar achrot. Now, both say, now remember again, here's the incredible part. What Yosef does for himself benefits us, because the way these milas work is the first person acquires it, but then ultimately, essentially what happens is that first person kind of programs it in our national DNA. So once Yosef acquires the level of tzidkus, once he acquires that level, by definition, it becomes part of our national DNA, and now each of us has the ability to access that koach as well. It's incredible. As Ber Mamar Abu Zal, listen to this. She'ena Amalek, he quotes over the Medrash Tanchuma. This is incredible. She'ena Amalek, nofel ella biyad zaro shal Yosef. But say there's only one shevet in particular that has the ability, that has the koach to overcome Amalek. Isn't this interesting? And what's the only nation that has the ability to overcome Amalek? The offspring of Yosef. Offspring of Yosef. He goes on, V'zeh mipnei sha'amalek hu shoresh ha'akshus neged ritzon Hashem Yisbarach va'akshus shal zera Yosef hu kiratz Hashem Yisbarach. We'll say, this is incredible. Do you want to hear something that's mamish mind-blowing? Mamish mind-blowing. Yosef and Amalek have the same exact koach. The same exact koach. They just use it in exactly opposite ways. See, what's Amalek? Amalek is akshos, right, Hattie? What's an action? Stubbornness. Yeah, stiff, right? Stiff neck. A stubbornness. What is Amalek? So Amalek is stubborn in their. They will not yield to the Ratzon Hashem. They will not yield to it, right? Amalek is all mikra. Amalek is all, nothing is from God, nothing is ordained, there is no plan, everything is happenstance. That's Amalek. Everything is mikra. They refuse to acknowledge the Ratzon Hashem. We'll say, what's Yosef? What's Yosef? Yosef refuses to acknowledge the wants and carnal desires of man. It's the same akshanos. It's the same stubbornness. It's the same unyielding nature. They just use it in two different ways. Amalek will not yield to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yosef will not yield to his Yetzer Hara. Right? They won't yield. They won't yield. Therefore, the Medrash says, and this is incredible, that Amalek could only fall into the hands ultimately of Yosef. It's only the individual, only the mishpacha, who has that midah of akshanos that could conquer Amalek, who is a paradigmatic example of evil akshanos. Well, so we'll have to stop over here for today. But I'll say, but you see, again, I just want to point out, just coming attractions, it's kedai. It's kedai to come back, which is, I'll say, like, we're going to go through this Maila after Maila after Maila. These are the Mailas of Klal Yisrael. They began ultimately, again, as the Mailas of individuals, then became the Mailas of Mishpachos, and then went on to become the Mailas of a nation. So really, really exceptionally incredible. And again, I will say, this one of tzidkus, of being shomer habris, sexual purity, is one which we'll spend a little bit of time on, because it is such an incredible struggle. And Yosef Hatzaddik has so much to be able to teach us in this regard. Me'ez Hashem will continue next week. Shkach Abosai. Thank you. All right, I will say good morning. Begin by thanking our sponsors, Naftoli and Chava Tilson, from Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the shiur and drushos this month, our Talmud Torah sponsors. Naftoli thanking his chaver Benjamin Wohl for introducing him to the Daf Yomi. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless us all to finish the Daf Yomi cycle together and celebrate to the Siyum in Eretz Yisrael Bekarov. To thank Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for Sivan. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu continue to protect our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, our children learning in Eretz Yisrael, and may Hashem, may our children complete their year of learning with a deep connection to the land and to Hashem's Torah. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Alan and Shari Steinmetz, commemoration of the yahrzeit of Alan's mother, Chaya Bas Reb Meir, to Jeff and Debbie Schwartz for dedicating the learning this week for a successful procedure and continued refuah for Jeff, and our day of learning sponsor, Bradley Bender, in honor of the commemoration of the 5th yahrzeit of his father, Louis Bender, Label Ben Ruvain, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. All right, Rebbe, say good morning. Let us begin. Very exciting. We have a new parak ahead of us today, and we are continuing in Eretz Hashem in the Avoda of Yom Kippur. So we're picking up Daf Mem Zayin. 47. Hotziu es hakaf es hamachta. So they would take out the kaf and the machta. I will say kaf, which it's often translated as a ladle, but it is a ladle. It's a big spoon, a big deep spoon, which I guess is called the ladle. Good. So they took out the ladle and the machta. I will say machta is the shovel. Now we're going to discuss why the Mishnah is bringing up the shovel again. We already spoke about the shovel in the last Mishnah. We'll discuss that. But Bepashas, remember again, what was the shovel used for? Right? Coals. Where were the coals taken from? Marocha Kitana, second pyre. Excellent. Good. So remember again. So they took out the kaf and the machta. They took out the utensils. Chafan melo chafna v'nosal so hakaf. So also we're going to see. So you would take for Ketores, the shiur of the Ketores was a handful. A handful. So we're going to discuss today, by the way, we'll talk about kamitzos, right, by the mincha, and we'll talk about handfuls by the Ketores. So they would take out the Ketores. Again, we'll discuss the mechanics of this in just a moment, and he would take a handful of it. So what happened? Hagadol fi godol, this is interesting. Now, I will say, so much of Judaism is about shiurim, and shiurim are precise. It's always fascinating when you see a little bit of a subjective shiur. So, for example, the shiur for Ketores is a handful. How much is a handful? How much is a handful? It depends, right? What does it depend on? The size of your hands. So the Mishnah says, Hagadol fi godlo, v'akatel fi katno. Okay, you know what? So year to year, I mean, hopefully it wasn't a new coin every year, but depending on the size of the coin's hands, was the size of the handful. The kach hayamidasa, not the kach hayamida, the kach haysamidasa. And I will say, so interestingly enough, the handful is a subjective shiur of Ketores. Not las hamachta biyamino, vesakaf bismolo. And then the Kohen Gadol would walk with the ladle in his left hand and the shovel in his right hand. Shovel in his right hand and the ladle in his left hand. Correct. So it says the Gemara, machta tanile. So I will say, it's interesting that the Mishnah is beginning with a discussion regarding the shovel. We already spoke about the shovel in the previous Mishnah. Machta tanile, not alas hamachta, va'ala l'rosh hamizbeach, v'chote v'yored. So we already spoke about last Mishnah. He takes the shovel, he goes up to the top of the altar. Remember again on Yom Kippur, he's not switching shovels. He's going up there with the gold shovel, using the gold shovel, long handle, right, to be able to help him out. He's going to the Marocha Kitana. He's taking out coals and he's coming down. Remember again, where does he place the shovel when he comes down? The Rovad Haravi, right? The fourth stair outside of the Heichal. So I already learned this. So why is this being stated again? To which the Gemara says, Hasam machta de gechalim. Oh, listen to this. In the last Mishnah, we were speaking about the shovel that was used for the coals, as the Mishnah said. Hacha machta de Ketores. I both said this is a second shovel. And what was in this shovel? Ketores. Now what does this mean? The Sanya hotziu lo kaf rekon milishkas hakelim umachto gidusha shel Ketores milishkas beis avatinas. He'll say, watch this. Now the Gemara fills in the blanks with the procedure. So the procedure went like this. They would go to the lishkas hakelim, right, the chamber where they used to keep the utensils. They would take out an additional shovel. What would they do with the additional shovel? They would go to lishkas beis avatinas. So we'll say, so remember again, where's lishkas beis avatinas? That is nun aleph, nun beis, nun aleph on your sheets over here. Here's lishkas beis avatinas. Good. So nun aleph on your sheets. So they will say, so what would happen? Remember again, we learned extensively about the Avatinas family. Remember again, they had the secret to the Ketores, and they did not share, at least initially. Ultimately, again, they did. They were choser b'tshuva. But at the end of the day, so they will say, listen to this. So they would go take a new shovel, go to the lishkas beis avatinas, and emerge from that with a shovel full of Ketores. Now we'll say, now what happens? So lishkas beis avatinas, and now we'll say, now the rest of the Mishnah makes sense. So there are two shovels. One shovel was being handled by the Kohen Gadol, where he went up to get the coals, came down, put that shovel down on the fourth step. They then brought out another shovel filled with Ketores, and what did the Kohen Gadol do with that shovel? That's where he would take the hand. So that shovel was larger. He would put both hands into that shovel. He would cup his hands together, emerge with a handful of Ketores, and then what would he do with that Ketores? Put it where? Into the ladle, into the kaf. So also it's very interesting. So remember, from the Lishkas HaKelim, 2 empty utensils were brought out, an empty ladle, an empty shovel. The empty shovel was taken to the Lishkas Beis Avatinas, the Avatinas chamber. There they filled it up with Ketores. They'd then bring that out to the Kohen. The Kohen would take the handful from that shovel and transfer that handful into the ladle. That's what would happen over here. Beautiful. Chafan melo chafnav, v'nosin l'socha kaf. Hagadol lefi hagadol, lefi gadol v'akat lefi katno, kach hay samidas. And Rebbe say again, what was unique about the handful is exactly that, a handful. Namely that halacha l'maisa, the size of the handful was dependent on the size of the kohen. Big hands, small hands, whatever it was, that's what it was. Says the Gemara, Kap Yom Kippurim lamali. So why do I need the ladle at all on Yom Kippur? Why do I need the ladle? So the Gemara says, Malo chafnav vehevi amrachmana. So we'll say, again, why not just, so this is interesting. So the Gemara is suggesting is, I understand I need the shovel to go into the Beis Avatinas to go ahead and bring out the shovel full of Ketores. But we'll say, so understand the process that's happening here. The Kohen's going to go ahead, he comes to the shovel with the Ketores. What does he do when he gets to the shovel? What does he do? Takes a handful. Then what does he do? Transfer into the ladle. Then ultimately, again, skipping a couple of steps, what does he do? He's going to, when he gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, transfer the Ketores from the ladle back into his hands. We didn't learn this yet. And then he's going to place that on the shovel with the coals. So the Gemara says, why don't you just bypass the ladle? In other words, why not just have him go ahead, take a handful from the shovel, and go in? In other words, why you see what's happening over here? You're taking a handful from the shovel, putting it into a ladle, carrying the ladle in, going ahead, and then transferring from the ladle into his hands. As Rabosai we're going to see a Herculean feat. Because remember, you can't spill any of the Ketores. So we're going to discuss this whole thing. The Gemara says, well, why? It's already in his hands. Just go and do it then. Says the Gemara, listen to this. So the Gemara says, Kaf b'yom kippur lamli, melo chafna vehevi amrachmana, mishum delo efshar. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why you need the ladle, because it's impossible to do it without the ladle. Why? Dehechi navid. What should we do? Dehechi navid. Na'ayo v'hader na'ayo hava achas amrachmani. So I will say, what should you do? When going into the Kodesh HaKadosh, should the Kohen Gadol make 2 trips? In other words, should he first take in the coals? See, I will say, remember again, when he goes into the Kodesh HaKadosh, also remember again, we saw in the beginning of the Masechta, the major machlokis on Yom Kippur between the Tzdukim and the Prushim was what? Between the Tzdukim and the regular Jews was what? How to do the Ketores. According to the Tzdukim, when did you put the Ketores on the coals? Before you went in, right? And according to Halacha, when do you put it in? When you go in. So remember again, so obviously we're going to pass that the Kohen Gadol is going to walk in with coals and with Ketores, and he's only going to put the Ketores on the coals inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the Gemara says, well, if he's holding a handful of ashes of Ketores, so I guess what he could do is he could first go in, put in the coals, come back out, get the Ketores, and go back in. The problem with that is the Torah really only allows for one entry into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's it. It's hava achos. The Torah says you're allowed to go in, and the Torah doesn't allow for repeated entries and exits into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to which the Gemara says, the Torah says he could bring it once, doesn't say he could bring it twice. So let's advance another possibility. Nishkale liktoras bechafnav, v'nachte lemachta Allah. So maybe you'll say, go ahead and take the Ketores in your hands, and maybe balance the shovel with the coals on top of your arms. So if you can imagine, right, you have the Ketores in your hands, go ahead and lay the shovel across your arms. Says the Gemara, okay, well, let's say so. So let's play this out. Let's say you manage to pull that off, and the Kohen Gadol gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim with the Ketores in his cupped hands, and the shovel essentially laying across his arms. So now what does he do? Nishkale bishina. So maybe what he'll do is he could take the shovel in his teeth, right? He could take the shovel in his mouth. They have a good dental plan in the base of English also, right? And then I will say, so what should he do? Take this. So okay, you could pull this off. You can go ahead and take the shovel in your teeth and then put it down somewhere, and then put the Ketores ultimately onto the shovel. So the Gemara says, come on. Hashta lifnei melech basar v'adam einosin kain. Lifnei melech malchei hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu alachas kama v'kama. So I will say, so again, you wouldn't act that way in front of a human king, taking stuff in your mouth and putting it down. You're going to do that in front of the Ribono Shel Olam. Hilchach lo efshar. So I will say, this is so fascinating. Therefore, the Gemara says essentially, there's no other way to accomplish everything but to put the Ketores into a ladle. That's the only way. The chayvan de lo efshar, and since it's impossible to do it any other way, avdinon kida'ashkechon b'nesim. We go ahead and we kind of fall back on what we saw by the Nesim. We'll say, what does it say by this? We just have this Parshas Naso. What does it say by the Nesim? Kaf achos melea Ketores. One spoonful, one ladleful of Ketores. So therefore, again, just like the Nesim used the kaf, they used the ladle, so too we use the ladle as well. And I will say, now what's riveting about this? Everything that we've learned until now, when it comes to the Avodah of Yom Kippur, is so highly scripted, right? Nothing is left to the imagination. And isn't it incredible that the Ketores, which is by far the most significant avodah of the day, the only avodah of the entire year that is done in the Kodesh HaKadosh, in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place in the entire world, there's like this piece that's unscripted. It's fascinating, right? So again, the Gemara essentially says, listen, we know we have to build in a ladle because there's no other, really? Ribono Shel Olam, you scripted every single other piece of this, but yet now there's one piece of the Ketores that's not scripted. So Kabi Meir Chash Baruch who's trying to teach us two lessons. Lesson number one is that sometimes in life the script isn't there, and you have to figure out what the Ratzon Hashem is. See, I will say there are times in life where the Ratzon Hashem is clear. We all know God wills us to be here in the morning, right? Sometimes I don't will myself to be here in the morning, right? But it is the Ratzon Hashem. It is the will of HaKadosh. That's an easy one. And then other times in life, the Ratzon Hashem is not so clear. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want? Sometimes the script is set. Sometimes the script is written. And sometimes, Ma Hashem evakesh, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want, is incredibly difficult to figure out. But that becomes the job of a Yid, that becomes the job of a Jew, to try to figure out what the Ratzon Hashem is, even in those unscripted moments of life. That's Aleph. Beis, another lesson, is that even within the script, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to find our own individuality. I think I've mentioned this before. The Belzer Rebbe, Tzidkas Hatzaddik Livracha, said that in the pasuk in Az Yashir we say, "Zekeli va'anveyu Elokei avi va'aro memenu." This is my God, and I will exalt him, the God of my father, and I will lift him up, or I will praise him. So the Belzer Rebbe says that a Jew has two relationships. I have Elokei avi, the God of my father. That's scripted God, right? That's scripted God. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu that my father had him, my grandfather had him, my great grandfather had him. That's scripted religion. And then there's Zekeli. Then there's my individuality. What's my unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So here the Kohen Gadol is going in for one of the moments of the greatest amount of spiritual intimacy. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Kohen Gadol, I want you to follow the script, but I also want you to bring you. Right? I also want you to bring a little bit of that individuality. I also want you to bring a little bit of that unscriptedness. Careful with the unscriptedness, but a little bit of the unscriptedness. Right, you can't go too far off the reservation on this. Right, so I want you. It's supposed to is an incredible yisod, the holiest avodah on the day in which everything is so carefully choreographed and scripted, yet such a profound detail. Kind of the Gemara backs into it. There's no other choice, so we have to use the ladle again, teaching us number one that the most difficult things in life are to try to figure out what the Ratzon Hashem is in the unscripted areas of life. And lesson number two is that yes, each of us has the script that we have to follow, but we also have to try to write a little bit of our own personal narrative in our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam as well. Incredible. Says the Gemara, so also listen to this. This is very interesting. So the Kohen Gadol walks in with the machta, the shovel in his right hand, and the ladle in his left hand. So the Gemara is very bothered by this. Yitziva ba'ara vigiyura b'shmei shmaya. So what this literally means, a yitziva is a citizen, right? So a citizen is going to be on the ground, and the giyura, the foreigner, is in the heavens. In other words, Rebbe say, what it's saying is like this: is that the Ketores is more important than the coals. So if anything, what should be in the right hand? The Ketores. Ketores should be in the right hand, and coal should be in the left hand. So the Gemara says it's like giving more importance to the immigrant, right, to the foreigner, than it is over the. This is not a political statement, by the way. I just want to be clear as Gemara, right? So the idea over here is we're giving greater precedence to the foreigner, to the ger, right, to the visitor, than we are ultimately to the citizen. What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says there's a utilitarian reason. Zumaruba v'zumuatas. We'll say there's a different reason. The coals are heavier, so it makes sense to use the dominant hand. I both say, what happens if the Kohen Gadol is a lefty? It's a trick question. Kohen Gadol can't do the avodah if he's a lefty, right? Being a lefty is a psul, for the kuna. Again, you could learn to use your right hand, but lamaisa, if he's left dominant, he would not go ahead and do this. In any event, the Gemara says he goes ahead and dafka carries the coals in the right hand, only because, again, it's just from a utilitarian perspective, just because the coals are heavier. Now, we'll say, listen to this. But we'll say it's not necessarily true. We'll say you could come up with a situation where the Ketores is just as heavy. How? How can you have a situation like that? Big-handed Kohen. So the Gemara says, bafilu b'zman sheshnei and shavin. Ukimai said Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. We're going to talk about this in just a moment. Why? But you could have a situation where the Ketores is just as heavy. Those are big hands, right? If the Ketores are just as heavy as the coals, the example is there was a Kohen Gadol like this, Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. So the Gemara says, still, you would carry the coals in the right hand. Why? Zuchama v'zu tzunenes. So both say, so remember again, it's hot coals, it's smoldering coals. So you really do, there's like a security concern over here. You do have to be careful. So the Gemara therefore says, whether it's because, I would venture to say that 99% of the time, the coals were heavier than the Ketores. But even in the off chance that was not the case, the coals were hot, the Ketores was not, and therefore halacha l'maisi, you would go ahead and carry the coals in the stronger hand. Now both say, the Gemara just mentioned Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis as an example of someone who had very large hands. He was a Kohen Gadol. So listen to this. Amru alav Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis sheyachulfein arba'as kabin b'meloch hafnar. Both say this is pretty wild. So Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis held 4 kabin. Both say, just to give you an idea, just like a kav is approximately a liter. Right? So it was a little bit less, it was a machlokes, if it's a little bit more, a little bit less. But if you could imagine, again, they're saying that his hands held 4 liters. 4 liters. We'll say, it's big hands. Now we'll say, could it be a bit hyperbolic? Sure. It could be also. It could also be. There's also any time you try to convert these shiurim, there is always a range. But in any event, just for your own illustrative purpose, just imagine something. Imagine the leader for just a moment. So the Gemara says, "Hayacholfin arba kabim meloch chofnav." Va'omer, listen to this. Kol anoshim zerdu vizarat ima ala legag, and he would often say, all of the women zerdu. Now Rashi says over here, we'll discuss what zerdu is in just a moment, but the zered of his mother ultimately again rose to the roof. Now what does that mean? Ikad da'amri ba'arson ukidra ba'yonason. So others say that Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis is referring to his mother's cooking. Right? He was extolling the virtues of his mother's cooking. Specifically, if you go ahead and you look, we'll get to it. So the Gemara says, actually look at Rashi, Ikad da'amri. Hi zered ba'arson kamar v'yafahu lechola. So we'll say, listen to this. So apparently, again, this is speaking specifically about arson, which was a dish made out of grain. And he was extolling the virtues of his mother's arson. Rashi says, Ustam noshem me'ubaros cholos va'ochlis zerid va'arson shen mine ma'chochitin. So I'll say, interestingly enough, apparently this was a food that was often consumed by pregnant women in an effort to give them strength. So Rabbi Shlomo ben Kimchis said, my mother not only made the best arson, she also consumed the arson when she was pregnant, and Rabbi Shlomo ben Kimchis was a very strong and strapping man. So he attributed ultimately his physical prowess and size to his mother's healthy cooking and eating habits. Interesting. So the Gemara says, Arson yafa lechola. Arson is healthy for a person who's ill. And again, as Rashi points out, specifically, pregnant women who are having a difficult pregnancy would eat the arson. And Kimchis attributes his physical vitality to his mother's cooking and consumption of arson. Good. Others say, b'shichva zera. Arson actually refers ultimately to semen. What does that mean? Rabbi Avo contrasts psukim. David Amal says in Tilim, "Vatazreni chayol lemilchama, uksiv hama'azreni chayol lemilchama." Amar Dalv Nechal Baruch Hu. David says Kadosh Baruch Hu, "Ribbono she'olam zerisani v'zersani," which literally means zerisani means you have girded me. Siyabo say the lashon of vatazreni and hama'azreni. So we translate those words ultimately again as girded, but it's also same lashon as zera. David HaMelech thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for essentially, literally, zersani means winnowing, v'zerosani means girded me with strength. So that was kiviyachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's millions of sperm that go to fertilize the egg, right? And only one makes it. And even then, it's not the whole sperm. It's only, Maharsha brings this in, it's only part of the sperm. It's interesting. I don't know at what point in time scientifically these things became known, but it's fascinating to see. So David HaMelech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, almost like kiviyachal, you took the best parts of everything to make me. So David HaMelech was thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the physical gifts he had and for the emotional, intellectual gifts he had. Saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I recognize that so many things can happen in the formation and maturation of a child in utero. And yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kiviyachal, like you winnowed the sperm, right? The same way that when you winnow grain, you take away the impurities, you take away the chaff. So David HaMelech was thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for being created physically complete, and not just physically complete. David HaMelech was very handsome. David HaMelech was fit. David HaMelech had ala milas on the physical level as well. Quite beautiful. So I will say, listen to this. Amra alav Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. So we'll say, now that we mentioned Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, and again, remember, it started because of the size of his hands. Now the Gemara tells a couple of stories about him. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, Pam acha siper dvarim im aravi echad b'shuk. We'll say, this is a pretty wild story. One time, Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis was talking with an Arab in the shuk. V'nitza tzinura mipiv al begadav. And what happened? So the we'll say sometimes when you're speaking with someone, so a little bit of saliva comes out. So a little bit of saliva came out from this Arab and landed on his clothing, and as a result, on Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis' clothing. As a result, so we'll say this was Yom Kippur. Now the saliva of an akum is metame. Now we'll say, I know what you're thinking. Why is he in the shuk on the Kohen? He's the Kohen Gadol. What is he doing in the shuk on Yom Kippur? So it's interesting. So the Maharsha comments on this. The Maharsha says there must have been some communal matter of importance which ultimately required the Kohen Gadol to go ahead and speak with this particular Gentile on Yom Kippur in the marketplace. So Rebbe say tells you something really absolutely amazing about the job of a leader. You could be Yom Kippur and you could be the Kohen Gadol, but when the community needs you, you go. You go. So the Kohen Gadol left the Beis HaMikdash in his big day kahuna, mind you. Or I take that back. That is not true. It doesn't have to be. He was going. He changed. He can't wear the big day kahuna outside of the Beis HaMikdash. He changed. But the point over here is he became tamei through this verbal exchange with the Arab. And what happened? Rabbi say v'nichnas yishaviv achav v'shimish tachto. So we'll say, interestingly enough, not a problem. There's a skan. Amazingly enough, who was the skan? It was his brother. It was his brother Yeshavev. Listen to this. V'rasa iman shnei kohanim gidolim b'yom echad. Isn't this incredible? And their mother Kimchis, saw two of her sons serve as the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Isn't that incredible? Granted, they're not doctors. It's true, right? So the pride is capped. But lamaisa, can you imagine that? Kimchis, the mother, that's almost completely the shenachas, seeing two of her sons serve in the capacity of Kohanim Gidolim on one Yom Kippur. Listen to this story. V'shuv amru alav Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, Pam achas yatzav v'siperem adon echad b'shuk. So we'll say another Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. One time he went out and he was speaking with someone else, adon echad, an important person in the shuk. V'nissa tzinor mipiv al begadav. And I will say it's the same story. And again on Yom Kippur. And what happens? Some spittle, some saliva from the Gentiles settles on him, and as a result, he becomes tamei. He cannot continue in the avodah. V'nichnas Yosef echa v'shimesh tachtov. And what happens? Again, it was another brother. Whatever happened to Yeshaveh, it was another brother, now Yosef, who was now the Skan. Rebbe Shlomo and Kimchis could not serve. Yosef, the Skan, serves. And once again, Kimchis, the mother, saw two of her sons serve in the capacity of Kohen Gadol over the course of one Yom Kippur. Pretty amazing. Says Gemara, Tan Rabbanan. Both said, listen to this. Listen to the Raisa says, Shiva banim hayila leKimchis. Both say it's incredible. Kimchis had 7 sons. Vikulan shimshu b'kahuna gidola. Both saying all of them were kahana gidola. Both say, by the way, all of them were good people, right? Because remember again, the Kuna Gadol, especially during the second Beis Hamikdash era, was often bought. These Kohanim, her 7 sons were righteous. And I want to be clear, not all 7 of them were full-fledged Kohanim Gadol. Remember, as you saw over here, a number of them occupied the position of Skan, right? And occupied the position of Skan, so they served in the position of the Kohen Gadol. Remember, again, I will say, in this case over here, when the Kohen Gadol becomes Tami and Yom Kippur, the Skan comes in, right? And then how long does the Skan serve for? Right? Just until the Kohen Gadol is able to come back for service. Remember again, and that's it. That's it. I will say, then remember, we saw the interesting part. What does the Skan do after he comes back, after he's no longer needed to be the Kohen Gadol? See, he's stuck a little bit. Because remember again, the Gemara says to go back to be a regular Kohen, you can't really do. You can't really do. See, he's kind of like Kohen Gadol emeritus, right? He kind of has like emeritus status. What are you doing? You have emeritus status? I hope one day to find out, right? And you're right? So you know, so what you kind of do is whatever you want. You just, you pop in, you pop out, you do whatever. But we'll say, but on a serious note, you're not really vested with the authority of the position. That's really what it is. You have a title, but no real authority. No real authority. So it says the Gemara says, so Kimchis had 7 sons. The Kulan Shimshu B'Kunin Gedola, they all serve this kind of Gedola. Amru Lo Chachamim. Both say, this is incredible. Ma Osis Shezochis Lekach. Both say, so they ask Kimchis, like, obviously you must have some type of schos. You must have some type of schos that you merited to have sons who all served in the community. Both say, in general, when you see people, I think all of us see this, when you see someone who you feel like really did a great job with their kids, right? So you see, like, you ask, like, how did you do it? Because parenting is so complicated, right? And raising healthy, normal, adjusted, whatever normal means, right? Adjusted, Holy Spirit. It's such a malacha. So you see someone who did it, you say, Mamish, how did you pull it off? So they said to Kimchis, how did you manage it? So listen to what she says. So she said, my hair was never uncovered in my home. Literally, again, the walls of my home never saw my uncovered hair. That's what Kimchis attributed it to. Shabbos says, so what does this mean? Kimchis attributed her ability to go ahead and raise holy children to her Tzniyus, to a level of modesty. Rebbe said, you ask yourself, well, I don't understand, what does one thing have to do with the other? I mean, it's incredible, and I guess obviously halacha doesn't demand that a married woman cover her hair inside the home. Halacha doesn't demand that. This was clearly a heightened level of tznius, but why does that translate into raising pious children? So we'll say, if you think about this in just a moment, one of the most important midos that we convey to our children is the midah of tznius. See, both say, people think that tznius is a dress code. Tznius is not a dress code. Tznius is a midah. One of the ways that the midah manifests itself is in the way that we dress. And by the way, not just for women. Tznius is not just like a woman thing. Tznius is a man thing. Being a tzanua person means being a modest and humble individual. See, say, when I possess humility, that triggers so many other positive things. If I'm humble, I realize I have more to learn. If I have more to learn, I'm open to learning from every individual. I'm open to working on myself. I realize that I have to push myself. If I'm humble, I don't get carried away with my accomplishments. I recognize that every accomplishment just shows me how much more I really can do. So I think when Kimchis says that the walls of my home never saw my hair, she wasn't just simply saying, well, because I never uncovered my hair, and that's schus, that's a school to have pious children. No, what she was saying, although not so many words, was, in my home, we were all about the midah of tznius, and not just in dress code, in approach to life. Because when you live a life and you raise a family with a midah of humility, right? When hubris has no place in the home, when arrogance has no place in the home, when we speak with humility, when we act with humility, when we live with humility, then ultimately that breeds tzidkus, an incredible yisod. So let's look how the story ends. The Yoma says, Amrullah, they said to her, okay, harbu asukin velo ilu. A lot of people try that and it hasn't worked, right? So I'll say, so now again, and what I want to point out is, remember, I'll say this is incredible. That doesn't mean they weren't accusing her of lying, right? They weren't saying, come on. What they were just saying is, there's no like secret sauce over here, right? There's no secret recipe. First of all, different things work for different people in different times, and there is no one way to raise a holy mishpacha. There are many ways and many again. We'll say what I also just point out to you is something absolutely amazing. Rebbe ben Kimchis, whose name is he known by? His mother's, right? We'll say, isn't this dramatic? That's not how we identify people in Gemara. Kimchis is his mother. So let's say, now again, I don't know about his father, but one thing is absolutely clear, which is his father was not the dominant role model in his life. It doesn't mean his father was a Rasha. It just could mean his father was just like, whatever. Just an ordinary guy, and his mother picked up all of the slack. I'm just pointing out something amazing, that if you think about it, there really is no excuse for not actualizing our greatness. Because a lot of times, Sigmund Freud was not the first one to discover this idea that who we are is rooted in our parents, right? Chazal had this much longer before Freud. It's true. Sometimes, again, we don't have great parents. It just happens. Sometimes we have terrible parents. It just happens for a variety of different reasons. So, Lamais, at the end of the day, you have two good parents, one good parent, no good parents. At the end of the day, you make of yourself who you want to make of yourself. In Kimchis, you have a family of Kohanim, Gedolim, and the father is not even mentioned. Not even mentioned. You have a group of Kohanim, Gedolim, who are all known by the name of their mother. Aside from highlighting the incredible influence that a mother has over her children, a very unique and an awesome influence, but also telling us that even from imperfect familial situations, righteousness can emerge. Let's go back to Rebbe saying incredible. Because I'm telling you, you could literally spend days on these Gemaras. There is so much to talk about over here. But it is not the 4-line Yomi, right? So let's go right there. So it says the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan, bekumso shlo yasem mida lekomet. So also listen to this. It says bekumso, a handful. You cannot make a midah. So also here's what's interesting. I might have thought that for efficiency purposes, I'm going to make a kli called the komets, right? What's the komets kli? It measures essentially an average handful. That's a komets, a kumso. You can't do that, the Gemara says. Shlo yasem mida lekomets. Ibarilu, because remember, the handful mamish has to be a real handful. So Ibarilu, the Gemara says kasha, maushi yasem mida lechafina. Can you make? I'm sorry, that's the komets. I'm sorry. The komets we're jumping at for a second is the mincha. Remember again, how do you take the mincha? 3 middle fingers, dip your fingers in, use the pinky and the thumb to shave off the sides. That's the amount that goes on the mizbeach. You can't make a kli for a kamitza shiur. So the Gemara says, maushi yasem mida lechafina. Can you go ahead and make a kli for a chafina, right? The kli that represents an average handful. Hasam hu dichsib bekumso. Aval hachad lo ksib bechafna. On one hand, by kamitza it says bekumso. It has to be a kamitza, not a kli. Here it doesn't say bechafnav. Ella melo chafnav ketores samim daka. The Torah does say you have to take a handful, and maybe a handful dafka has to be. We need the coin to go with his hands into the ketores, and you can't use a kli. Olo. So the Gemara says, O Dilma, yalif melo mikumso. So Tashma, so we'll say, which is it? So do you have to use dafka, a handful, or can you make a kli? So Tashma, v'kach haisamidasa, my love shimrat alasos midacheres ose. So we'll say, doesn't that mean that what, if you want to make a kli, that's a handful kli, you could do so? To which the word is low. Hachi kamar v'kach haya chozer v'chafna lifnim. Shamas mina hachofein v'chozer v'chofein. So we'll say the fact that ultimately, again, the coin is taking repeated handfuls over the course of this process, right? First handful from the shovel, then from the ladle, indicates to us that you cannot withdraw the ketores with a kli. That's an approximate handful shiur, but rather you must withdraw the actual handful itself. To which the Gemara says, "Dilma shimrat alasos mida ose inam mishlo yachsaf shlo yosir." Or maybe the other passage will say is that what that halacha lamaisa. If you want to make a kli, you can make a kli. But lamaisa, the ikr is that you cannot go ahead and add on or diminish the amount. So we'll say the Gemara doesn't answer the question. Lamaisa, we are going to see the same way you cannot make a kamitza kli, you also cannot make a chafina kli. Remember again, chafina means a handful. You cannot make a kli that measures out an approximate handful. Tan Rabbanan, melo kumso. Torah says you have to take a full kometz. Yochel mavuratz. So I'll say, I might have thought that when I take the kmitza, we're jumping back and forth, back to the mincha. I might have thought that when I take the kmitza of the mincha, I can take mavuratz. So I'll say, what does mavuratz mean? Mavuratz means, if you can imagine, where the flour is kind of spilling out to the sides over here. Right, so there's overflowing flour out of my 3 fingers. So I would have thought that I could bring a mavuratz tam lower bekumso. Therefore, the Torah says no. You have to bring an exact kometz. So say if would have just said bekumso, I would have thought maybe I will say the way I take the kmitza is like this. I take the tips of my fingers, insert it into the flour, and pull out. We'll say, see, my visual aids over here, right? You see this amount. Maybe that's all I have to take. To which the Gemara says, you have to take a full kometz like people take a kmitza. How do you take a kmitza? So we'll say, what do? You go ahead and you dip 3 fingers into the fine flour. So we'll say, if you can imagine, you have a bowl of fine flour, you put your middle 3 fingers in there, you scoop up, and whatever gets trapped inside of those fingers, ultimately, again, is the kmitza. That is the part of the carbon mincha that is offered up on the mizbeach. The rest of the carbon mincha will say, what's its status? That's called shirayim, leftovers. What do you do with the shirayim? That's the property of the kohen. I will say with the minchas machvas and minchas marcheshes, I will say what's unique now. Machvas these are both fried menachos. So machvas is a flat pan fried menachos. Marcheshes is a deep pan fried menachos. I will say these are more complicated. Why? Because the way you would go ahead and make these menachos, I will say, is first you would fry it, then you would break it into pieces, and the kohen would then do the kmitza from the pieces. And I will say it's much more difficult to do the kmitza from the pieces. Why? Because lamaisa, you scoop it up, and then what do you have? Generally, you have pieces that jut out. So what do you do over there? Mochik begodlo milamala be'etzmo ketana milamata. So v'zoy avo the kadosh shebemikdash. So we'll say, what would you do? So you would scoop up the kmitza pieces, right? And then what you would do is you would use your pinky and your thumb. This was right to go ahead and shave off the parts that were jutting out. And the Gemara says this was the hardest avoda in the mikdash. Because also you need some good amount of finger dexterity for this, right? To go ahead and, remember, with flour it's easy, because flour you just go ahead and you scoop up, and the truth is, even if you don't go ahead and use your finger and your pinky, the particles kind of just fall away. But if you're scooping up pieces, the pieces jut out to the sides. So I will say what you have to do is, you have to shave off the part that's jutting out without pulling out what? The rest of the piece that's embedded in your fingers. This is mamish like an avodah. The Gemara says this was the hardest avodah in the mikdash. The Gemara says, Zoe Vesula, really? That was the hardest avodah in the mikdash? V'ha'ika malika? What about malika? I'll say now, malika, that's an avodah. Remember again, what are you doing? You got that bird in your hand, right? Sharp thumbnail going through the back, right? Separating again the vertebrae, right? The backbone of the bird, but you can't, and you have to flick off the head, but you can't flick off the entire head, right? It's got to be still attached by the flap of skin on the front. Right, so it's got to be. So we'll say now that's an avodah kasha. It's interesting about saying the Gemara calls chafina, the handful, also a hard avodah. It's interesting because that doesn't sound so hard. The reason it's going to be hard is because you can't spill anything. So we'll discuss that. So the Gemara says no. So it doesn't mean to say that kmitza is the hardest. Elazohi me'avodos kasha shebemikdash. It means that ultimately, again, kmitza is amongst the harder avodos in the mikdash. It's not the hardest, but it's part of this category of difficult malachas, of difficult avodos. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Izal, Ben Habinayim Shamali Kumso. I was listening to this question. What about what about a regular kmitza, where you're going ahead and you're drawing fine flour? What's the status of the flour in between your fingers? Right. So we'll say, let's say flour gets trapped in between your fingers. What's the status? Is that part of the kmitza or not? So we'll say, if it's part of your fingers but on the inside of your hand, that's not a kasha, that's obviously part of the kmitza. And we'll say, if there are flour particles on the outside of your hand, that's certainly not part of the kmitza. What's right? If it's on the inside of your hand, it's part of the kmitza. Outside of your hand, it's part of the shrine, not part of the kmitza. We'll say, what's the shaila? Literally, the particles that get stuck in between my fingers. What's the status? It's a safek. So we'll say, so again, remember, you can imagine this really very clearly with flour itself. Flour mamish gets stuck in between my fingers. So what do I do with that flour? The Gemara says it's a safek. Okay, what do I do with a suffix? So let's listen to this. Rabbi Chanina, Maktir chometz l'chudei tchila, v'hadra ben abinayim. First, you go ahead and you offer up the chometz first, that which is in your hand, and then you take the particles that were stuck in between the fingers, and you offer them up separately. So the Gemara says, because ultimately, again, if you would go ahead and offer up the particles that are between the fingers first, dilma shirayim ninu, perhaps they have the status of shirayim, the leftover part of the karban mincha, v'habilu shirayim shechasru ben kamitza la'aktara. And I will say the problem is, if you go ahead and you offer up, or you diminish shirayim in between kamitza and the offering up of the kamitza, the carbon is ineffective. Amar mar shirayim shechasru bin kamitza laktara ein maktirin alenas achomes. Somehow, if the shirayim became deficient in between the taking of the komets and the offering up of the komets, ultimately again, you cannot offer up the komets. Ihachi hashtanami ikrikan kol shememeno leishim harihu bebal taktiru. So I will say ultimately again we could apply over here the concept that halacha lemaisa, if you look at Rashi, kol shemen al ishim me'achar shenasata leish kol mishpato hari shirayim b'bal taktiru. Ultimately, again, after you go ahead and offer up the komets, the shirayim should be prohibited. So how can you burn the shirayim? Ultimately, after going ahead and burning the karban mincha, Rabbi Huda, Berei Reb Shimon ben Pazi. So what the Gemara is just trying to figure out is, what do you do with the saftey particles that are stuck in between your fingers? So first suggestion the Gemara makes is, first offer up the kamitza, then offer up the particles. Because if you offer up the particles first, that means the shirayim is deficient before the offering up of the kamitza. And hilchos karban mincha is that if the shirayim becomes deficient before the offering up of the kamitza, the karban is invalid. That's fine, says the Gemara, but there's a problem. What's the problem? Halacha l'maisa, if I offer up the kamitza and then I offer up the shirayim, the halacha is you're not allowed to offer up shirayim on the mizbeach. So how can you offer up the particles after the kamitza has been offered? So let's listen to this. No. When you put the particles on the mizbeach, you're not putting the particles on there b'toras mincha, but rather you're putting b'toras kamitza. You're putting the particles on there as what? As wood. Essentially, you're not offering it up as a sacrifice. You're just putting it on there with the status of wood. So Rabbi Eliezer says that when in doubt about these particles, you cannot offer them up as a karban mincha. Because also, remember, we run into the problems, the aforementioned problems. What you can do is ultimately put them on the mizbeach as eitzim, as wood. Rabbi Eliezer. So also that works well according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi say, get ready for this. We have a great solution. We will say, the only people who do kamitza? Fat kohanim. Right? They will say, what's the advantage of using an obese kohen? Fat fingers. Right? I don't know if that's the politically correct term, but you understand what I mean, right? Large, thick fingers. So I'll say, what's the great part about thick fingers? Nothing gets stuck in between. So we only use heavier kohanim, obese kohanim, for the kamitza. This way, again, we sidestep the entire particle issue. So the Gemara says, Hashta da'asis lahachi. Now that we came to this idea, Rabbi Eliezer nami lechatchila dekansi shmeini. So the Gemara says, wow, this is so much better. So therefore, when it comes to particles, the Gemara says like this. The particles on the inside of your hand, what's their status? Right? Kamitza. Right? Kamitza, that's part of the mincha. Particles on the outside of the hand, shirayim. Right? The shaila is particles on the inside of the hand. So we have an eitzah. Eitzah number one is offer up the kamitza first, and then offer up the particles. But how are you offering up the particles? As what? Eitzim. It's not a mincha, because if you go ahead and offer it up as a mincha, it ruins everything. Offer it up as eitzim. Or the second approach, says the Gemara, is just use kohanim with thicker fingers. Right? If you use thick-fingered kohanim, then Allah Lamaisa, nothing gets stuck in between anyway, and sidestep the entire shir. Shabbos tells you in incredible Musar, this will have to stop. Incredible Musar. It will say, sometimes in life, you have to find solutions to problems, and sometimes the best solution is sidestepping the problem to begin with. Sometimes you have to find solutions, sometimes you have to sidestep. All right, we'll stop over here. Continue tomorrow, Mirat Hashem. Shkoyach. Horizontal. Thank you.